Good afternoon, friends. Today is Thursday, October 29th. And already thinking this week about the feasts of this weekend to come. That is, of course, Halloween and hallowed evening, the eve before the Feast of All Saints, and what's celebrated as the Dia de los Muertos by the Latino community, the Day of the Dead. But our dual celebration, if you will, of the Feast of All Saints and the Feast of All Souls, distinct feasts, but obviously related. It is that time of year, and I will say that there seems to, that with the changing of the seasons, there's always this sense of grief that kind of rises. And again, especially this year, it's been my experience, really both personally and in my ministry or in just conversations with people. I mean, there's much to grieve. Without going into the obvious, but all those regular things we've lost or aren't able to celebrate. People already grieving Thanksgiving, for example, and not being able to gather with folks as we normally do. We just in a staff meeting, a Zoom call meeting. Prior to this, I was feeling very sad about, we were talking about how we will celebrate the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe this year. Anyhow, you all have those experiences in your life, and some are small losses, some are great losses. And obviously what this season calls us to in the church, is to remember, to not too hastily sweep aside the grief, but to take it out, to hold it, to look at it, to grieve, to place it in the hands of God, and more to the point, to grieve our beloved dead, and to place them in the hands of God. We all have our stories, don't we, of the presence of death or experiences of death, some very fresh in our lives. I can't get really through this season without thinking about, as we enter their names in the Book of the Dead, always my grandfather, George. My one of the first experiences of death that I recall consciously. I will say, and this is really digging into my journal, but one of my first conscious memories ever is being at and what I think to be true, and I've checked it out with family subsequently, and they say, yeah, that sounds like that's what really happened, was just as a toddler, I would have been at my great-grandmother's funeral, but my first conscious memory being that of a funeral. But my first real experience of walking through death was my grandfather. I think if I did the math correctly just now, I would have been 12 at the time that he died. And it was those days where there were 2 nights of wakes at the funeral home, so a lot of people, a lot of grieving, a lot of mourning, a lot of funeral home, hanging around the funeral home, which wasn't an uncommon experience for my family. I mean, I going to wakes, going to visit those who were grieving, was kind of just another rhythm in our social lives. We did that a lot. But what I do remember most profoundly about my grandfather's funeral and that first real experience of, well, I remember one thing that stands out too is that I don't know that it was particularly close to my grandfather. He was a stoic, very stoic, Polish, almost silent character in my life. I'm not sure that I could even recall what his voice sounded like. So little did he speak. But my grandmother was very close to, one of the closest relationships of my life. And what I do remember about those days and her was watching this very strong woman just kind of melt under the grief of it all. Which was, for a young kid, very striking, and very startling, and very unsettling to see my formidable grandmother reduced to a puddle of tears for the first time ever. But the other very clear memory I have of those days, it was the first time ever that I had touched a person who was dead. So I reached into my parents encouraged me to touch him. And I felt his hands, and it was like feeling wood. And that was startling to me. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting that. But I also remember my mother reaching in and stroking his hands and talking to him in a way as if he were alive. And that was deeply consoling for me. Which is to say that, more than my own grief over my loss and my grandfather's death, I was concerned about my grandmother. I was concerned about my mother at the loss of her father, and what it meant to her, what it would do to her, how it would hurt her. And to hear her kind of carrying on, talking to him as if he were alive, taught me something about, though I wouldn't have the words for it for a long time, of course, but it taught me about the communion of what we call in our tradition, the communion of saints. That we're united with the dead. We're united with those living in heaven. We're united with the saints. In a way that, I suppose some people would consider creepy or macabre or otherworldly or something. But it's true, right? I mean, we are connected to people in a way that transcends our bodies. And so this spiritual connection, conversing with, praying for those who have died, feeling their presence. I've often said, visiting my own mother's grave, I don't feel a particular presence with her there, but it's always, in the bowl of noodles or a meal or being with a brother that makes her presence come alive. It's that element of our faith that we embrace at this time of the year. So as grief surfaces, as we remember the dead, we remember our communion with them. We remember where they are, because where they are is where we hope to follow, right? And so they, in some sense, draw us there. So, I'd like to share a poem by John O'Donohue, or a prayer. It's actually in a book of blessings. Which is called On the Death of the Beloved. Though we need to weep your loss, you dwell in that safe place in our hearts where no storm or night or pain can reach you. Your love was like the dawn, brightening over our lives, awakening beneath the dark a further adventure of color. The sound of your voice found for us a new music that brightened everything. Whatever you enfolded in your gaze quickened in the joy of its being. You placed smiles like flowers on the altar of the heart. Your mind always sparkled with wonder at things. Though your days here were brief, your spirit was alive, awake, complete. We look toward each other no longer from the old distance of our names. Now you dwell inside the rhythm of breath, as close to us as we are to ourselves. Though we cannot see you with outward eyes, we know our soul's gaze is upon your face, smiling back at us from within everything to which we bring our best refinement. Let us not look for you only in memory, where we would grow lonely without you. You would want us to find you in presence, beside us when beauty brightens, when kindness glows and music echoes eternal tones, when orchids brighten the earth, darkest winter has turned to spring, May this dark grief flower with hope in every heart that loves you. May you continue to inspire us to enter each day with a generous heart, to serve the call of courage and love until we see your beautiful face again in that land where there is no more separation, where all tears will be wiped from our mind and where we will never lose you again. A lovely Irish inspired prayer and poem. God bless you. Thank you. May God bless you throughout this month of loss and resurrection.